I've always been fascinated by human nature, the way we can present one face to the world while hiding another. But have you ever wondered how someone can deceive everyone, even those closest to them, and commit the most heinous acts without arousing suspicion? Today, we'll delve into the mind of a man who managed to do this repeatedly, to the point of defying logic itself. This is the story of a man who not only became one of the most infamous serial killers in history, but also managed to outwit the system not once, but 3 times. I'm talking, of course, about Ted Bundy, a name that sends shivers down the spine even decades after his execution. He wasn't your typical killer. Bundy was charismatic, educated, and possessed an intelligence that disarmed anyone. On the surface, he seemed harmless, even charming. People who knew him spoke of his captivating smile, his calm demeanor, and the confidence he exuded. And that was precisely his greatest weapon. In the 1970s, America was caught in a blend of innocence and terror. Society had yet to fully grasp the idea that a normal man, a neighbor, a co-worker, could harbor a monster within. Bundy exploited that void, that collective naivety, to commit some of the most horrific crimes ever recorded. What's most startling is that even after being arrested, he continued his charade, manipulating the justice system in ways that seemed straight out of a fiction movie. What makes me wonder is, what made Bundy so effective in his deceptions? Was it his physical appearance? His ability to adapt to any situation? Or perhaps something deeper? Could it be that on some level, he understood the most intimate fears and desires of people and knew exactly how to exploit them? That's the central mystery we'll explore today. Throughout this story, you'll see how Bundy used every part of his personality to manipulate everyone around him, from his victims to the authorities. We'll explore how, despite his intelligence, his egocentrism and narcissism ultimately led to his downfall. But before that, it's important to understand how Ted Bundy's image was crafted, the perfect wolf in sheep's clothing. Bundy was more than a killer. He was a master of deception, a man who, against all odds, managed to evade justice on 3 separate occasions, becoming a macabre legend in the process. What drove him to believe he could outsmart authorities time and again? Was it pure arrogance, or was he truly intelligent enough to stay one step ahead? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how could someone who seemed so normal hide such deep darkness for so long? What makes this story even more chilling is that Ted Bundy was nothing like the serial killer most of us would imagine. He wasn't a gloomy man, holed up in his house, detached from society. On the contrary, he was an ambitious young man, well-connected socially, with a promising career in politics. Someone you might have met at a party, smiled at on the street, or trusted to help you in everyday situations. Yet, beneath that facade of normalcy lay a cold, calculating mind, capable of deceiving and terrorizing everyone who crossed his path. His ability to convince people he was someone they could trust is what allowed him to commit so many crimes without being discovered for years. What's even more unsettling is how Bundy used his charisma not only to hunt his victims, but also to manipulate the authorities. Even when he was arrested, his ability to escape not only demonstrated his cunning, but also highlighted the flaws in a system that never saw someone like him coming. Can you imagine what it takes to escape from prison 3 times? We're not talking about simple breakouts. What Bundy achieved was a display of shrewdness and coldness. And he did it while maintaining that calm smile, that appearance of being a normal man. That's the paradox of Ted Bundy, a man whose public image never reflected the monstrosity of his actions. So, if you ever thought you could recognize a monster when you saw one, Ted Bundy would make you question that certainty. This is the story of a man who, until the very end, played with perception and reality. Ted Bundy, the perfect deception. When you think of a serial killer, you probably picture someone gloomy, antisocial, someone who could instill distrust just by looking at them. But Ted Bundy didn't fit that image. And that, precisely, was his most lethal trick. I remember seeing one of the earliest photos of Bundy. A man with a kind face, well-groomed, with a smile that seemed genuine, almost friendly. It was hard to imagine that this young man, who could have been the neighbor next door or the classmate everyone admired, could have committed the crimes that made him one of the most infamous serial killers in history. Ted Bundy was a man of many faces. At first glance, his life seemed destined for success. He had a college education, was studying law, and was known for his charisma and charm. He could enter a room and, with just a few words, become the center of attention. What very few knew was that beneath that perfect facade, there was a cold, calculating mind capable of unimaginable atrocities. One of the most puzzling aspects of Bundy is how he managed to deceive everyone around him, even those who knew him well. How could someone so seemingly charming and normal lead such a macabre double life? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that he understood perfectly how people's perceptions worked. He knew what others wanted to see and provided exactly that. I find it incredible how Bundy presented himself to the world as a likable, ambitious young man with a bright future. His intelligence, combined with his ability to read people, made him the perfect master of deception. He could earn anyone's trust within minutes, and once he had it, he used that power for his own ends without anyone suspecting his true intentions. For Bundy, the key to his success in his crimes was not only in the planning, but also in his ability to appear harmless. He knew how to disguise his true intentions with a friendly smile and a convincing speech. This duality is what makes him so terrifying. He was the least suspicious monster, someone who could blend into any crowd. During the years he committed his crimes, Bundy moved through different states in the U.S., always changing his appearance, behavior, even his way of speaking. But there was one thing he always kept intact: his ability to gain trust. I imagine the scenario: a young woman alone, perhaps at a university or walking down a dark street. Suddenly, Ted Bundy appears, maybe with a cast on his arm or pretending to be in some sort of trouble, asking for help. His polite demeanor and soft voice would make anyone let their guard down. And once he got the victim to approach, it was all over. The most terrifying thing is how Bundy knew exactly whom to choose. His profile was clear: young, attractive women with promising futures. He knew they would be the perfect victims. And yet, the system failed to catch him. He was arrested several times, of course, but always seemed to find a way to move on, as if nothing could stop him. But the question that always comes to mind is, how could someone with such a normal life become one of the most notorious serial killers in history? Some criminal psychology experts have tried to unravel Bundy's mind, and what they found is a complex mix of narcissism, sociopathy, and a deep need for control. For Bundy, his crimes were not only a way to satisfy his dark impulses, but also a power game. Every time he deceived someone, every time he managed to go unnoticed, it was like a confirmation of his superiority. Bundy enjoyed manipulation. He didn't just like deceiving people, he seemed to revel in the fact that no one saw it coming. His prison escapes, his lies during interrogations, and even his own trial were like a spectacle to him, where he was the protagonist and everyone else, mere spectators. The most disturbing part is that even when he was finally captured, he continued trying to control the narrative. During his trial, Bundy decided to represent himself. Can you imagine the audacity? Here was a man accused of brutal murders, and yet his confidence was such that he believed he could deceive the system once more. He stood before the judge with the same calm smile, trying to convince the world of his innocence. However, despite his efforts, the truth eventually came to light. But what remains a mystery is how Bundy managed to maintain his facade for so long. How could he lead a seemingly normal life while committing such atrocious crimes in secret? It's a question that continues to haunt everyone who has studied his case. Ted Bundy's life is a chilling reminder that sometimes danger can be much closer than we imagine. People who seem kind, those who easily earn our trust, might be hiding the darkest secrets. In Bundy's case, it was his ability to disguise himself as the perfect guy that made him one of the deadliest serial killers in history. But what's most unsettling is that Bundy knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that his appearance and charisma would be his greatest weapons. Every time he managed to go unnoticed, every time he deceived someone, it was like a confirmation of his own superiority. In his mind, he was playing a game whose rules only he knew. The story of Ted Bundy is the story of a man who lived a double life, who deceived everyone around him while committing some of the most horrific crimes ever recorded. It's the story of how someone can seem completely normal, even charming, while hiding an unfathomable darkness within. And that, more than anything else, is what makes him such a terrifying figure. Bundy was not just a serial killer. He was the master of deception, a man who, against all odds, managed to hide his true nature in plain sight. The rise of the monster. The true horror of Ted Bundy lies not only in his crimes, but in how he ascended to his own dark power, cultivating his image until he became a meticulous and ruthless predator. It was as if he had discovered a path to his worst self and walked it without looking back. I remember that, in my research, what struck me most was how Bundy perfected his method. He didn't start as the monster he became. Instead, like an actor rehearsing his role over and over, he refined his technique, adapting it to each situation. In a sense, Bundy was building his legend through trial and error, manipulating not only his victims but everyone around him. One of the most disturbing aspects of his story is how, despite his brilliance, intelligence, and cunning, all of that was subordinated to his darkest impulses. It was as if he were waging an internal battle, where for every small triumph in his public life, the darkness gained a little more control. The beginning of his obsession. Bundy's true rise began when he started giving free rein to his violent fantasies. While the details of his early years are vague, we know that Bundy, from a young age, had a disturbing obsession with control. This obsession was not just about physical power, but psychological power, about dominating another human being entirely. I imagine those early moments when he began contemplating the unthinkable. In his mind, it was a kind of game. He couldn't act impulsively, he needed to plan, observe, learn. And that's what he did. He began studying the people around him, how they reacted to certain stimuli, what made them trust, and what made them feel vulnerable. Young Bundy was not like most teenagers. While others focused on their studies, socializing with friends, or falling in love, he was designing in his mind the perfect scenario to carry out his crimes. It's not hard to picture him walking around campus, analyzing every woman who passed by, wondering how he could lure them into his trap. As his fantasies grew, so did his confidence. And soon, the monster within him was no longer content with merely imagining it. The first assault. It was in 1974 when Bundy took the first step that would lead him to notoriety. He moved to Seattle to continue his law studies, but in reality, his mind was elsewhere. That year, women began disappearing in the area. One after another, young university students vanished without a trace. What Bundy did during that time was not improvised. It was meticulously planned. Most of the time, he would present himself with a cast on his arm or on crutches, making him seem harmless, like someone who needed help. In this way, he would convince his victims to accompany him to his car. Most of the time, that would be the last moment they would be seen alive. It's chilling to think how Bundy could transform a situation of help into one of pure terror in a matter of seconds. Can you imagine the confusion of those young women when, after believing they were helping someone, they realized they were trapped in an inescapable nightmare? It's hard to process, but at that moment, Bundy was no longer just a man. He had become a predator lurking in the darkness, always one step ahead. The Lake Sammamish case. July 14, 1974, was one of the most horrifying days in Bundy's history. That day, 2 women disappeared from Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular summer destination. What was terrifying was how Bundy abducted them in broad daylight, among crowds of people. He approached both women introducing himself as Ted and asked for help carrying something to his Volkswagen Beetle. That was their last contact with the outside world. Lake Sammamish was a turning point. This is where the police finally began to connect the dots. Several people remembered seeing a man named Ted talking to the young women before their disappearance and described the same car, a Volkswagen Beetle. It was a blow to Bundy. For the first time, the police had a solid lead. I remember how, reading about this case, I couldn't help but think about Bundy's arrogance. What made him believe he could act so openly, in broad daylight, and not be caught? Maybe it was his confidence in his ability to remain undetected, or perhaps he had begun to underestimate those around him, believing no one would be smart enough to discover him. The journey west. After the murders in Seattle, Bundy felt the pressure. He knew the net was closing in, so he decided to move. That's when he began his killing spree in Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. His modus operandi remained the same, choosing young, vulnerable women, deceiving them with his charm, and then abducting and killing them. One of the most shocking cases was Karen Campbell, a nurse who disappeared while on vacation in Colorado. Like the others, she vanished without a trace, and when her body was found, it was clear she had been brutally murdered. Bundy was refining his technique, and each crime was bolder than the last. However, the killer didn't anticipate that his arrogance would eventually betray him. During a traffic stop in Utah, he was pulled over for a minor infraction. In his car, the police found a ski mask, a crowbar, ropes, and handcuffs. Although there was not enough evidence to directly link him to the murders, Bundy was arrested for possession of burglary tools. This was the first real blow to Bundy. He knew that although they didn't yet have enough to convict him of murder, the police were beginning to close in dangerously. And still, his arrogance didn't wane. He seemed convinced he could continue to outsmart the system. The first escape. And it was precisely that arrogance that led him to escape from prison in 1977. After being extradited to Colorado to face trial for Karen Campbell's murder, Bundy decided he wouldn't wait to learn his fate. He was in the prison library, preparing for his own defense when he seized a moment of distraction and jumped out of the window. He was on the run for several days before being captured again. The most terrifying part of this escape was not just Bundy's audacity, but what it revealed about his personality. To him, life was a game. A game in which, if he were clever enough, he could always find a way to escape. No matter how many times he was caught, in his mind, he was always one step ahead. The second escape and the Florida massacre. Bundy wouldn't stop there. While awaiting trial in another Colorado prison, Bundy once again outwitted the system, this time in an even more incredible manner. He lost weight to squeeze through a hole in the ceiling of his cell and, after several days of planning, escaped once more. His escape led him to Florida, where he committed one of his most brutal crimes, the murder of several women in the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. That night, he entered the house while the students were asleep and attacked them savagely. 2 of them died, and several others were left severely injured. This attack was a point of no return for Bundy. He was no longer merely trying to satisfy his dark impulses, he was acting with unrestrained, almost irrational violence. It was as if the monster inside him had taken complete control. The end of the rise. Bundy's rise culminated when he was finally captured after a car chase in Pensacola, Florida. This time, there would be no more escapes. He was arrested and brought to trial for the Chi Omega murders, where, for the first time, the world saw the real Ted Bundy, not the charming, charismatic young man, but the ruthless monster hiding beneath that facade. The most disturbing thing is that even at his trial, Bundy tried to maintain control. He chose to represent himself, a decision that only reinforced his belief that he could manipulate the system once more. But this time, it didn't work. The truth came to light, and the world witnessed the rise and fall of one of the most notorious killers in history. It's strange to think about how someone with so many opportunities in life chose this dark path. And it's even more terrifying. The first escape, Aspen, Colorado. When I think of Ted Bundy's escape in Aspen, Colorado, I can't help but feel a mix of disbelief and admiration for his cunning, coupled with a deep fear of the calculating mind that orchestrated his getaway. We're not talking about a simple escape, but a meticulously planned act executed with chilling confidence. This man, with his impeccable appearance and irresistible charm, managed to evade justice not once, but twice. And Aspen was just the first display of his dangerous skill in evading control. The trial in Aspen. It all began in June 1977. Ted Bundy was on trial in Aspen for the murder of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse whose body had been found near a resort in Colorado. It was one of the few times the judicial process advanced quickly against Bundy, who, in his overflowing narcissism, insisted on representing himself in court. A fatal mistake for many, but for Bundy, his decision was part of a much deeper plan. In his mind, Bundy was already plotting an exit. Representing himself, he had access to certain privileges that other inmates could only dream of: access to the court's library and the opportunity to walk around without handcuffs, giving him an unusual freedom for someone accused of murder. It was as if the system was playing into his hands, and he knew exactly how to exploit it. I recall reading about the preparations before his trial, and what struck me the most was his total confidence. While other defendants would tremble at the prospect of a murder trial, Bundy seemed excited. He knew that if he played his cards right, he could turn a courtroom into a playground. The plan takes shape. Ted Bundy was a man who was always a step ahead of his captors. He knew that to escape, he needed time and patience. Since arriving at the Aspen jail, he began plotting every little detail that would allow him to flee. He realized that the courthouse library, on the second floor, had a window that wasn't secured. It wasn't a big jump from there to the ground, but he would need the perfect opportunity to execute it. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Bundy? Scanning his surroundings, analyzing every guard's movement, every small detail of the building. The monster inside him was fully in control, calculating every possible exit, every possible flaw in the system. And when the day of the trial came, he was more than prepared. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was taken to the courthouse library to review some legal documents. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He wasn't wearing handcuffs, and the guards weren't watching him closely. The library was almost empty, and the window he had observed so many times was there, just a few steps away. It was now or never. The leap to freedom. Taking advantage of the guard's negligence, Bundy acted with the precision of a predator at the perfect moment. He climbed through the window and, with surprising agility, jumped from the second floor to the ground. He slightly injured his ankle upon landing, but not enough to stop him. At that moment, Bundy was outside the courthouse, and for the first time since his capture, he was a free man. Imagine for a moment what must have gone through his mind in those first minutes of freedom. The man who had outwitted the system was running through the mountains of Aspen, fleeing from justice and advancing toward his own narrative of power and control. He must have felt uncontrollable adrenaline, a sense of triumph and defiance against a world that thought it had defeated him. The escape into the mountains. But Bundy was not a man of luck, he was a man of plans. He knew that to stay free, he needed more than just courage. He ran toward the forest, knowing that the mountains would be his best ally. The Aspen Mountains are vast and challenging, filled with trails, canyons, and places where a man can easily get lost. And Bundy, with his analytical mind, was convinced he could evade the police for days, maybe weeks. What followed was a manhunt that seemed straight out of a movie. As authorities began frantically searching the town, Bundy moved toward the mountains, trying to gain ground and get lost in nature. But nature was not on his side. As he ventured into the forest, Bundy quickly realized he wasn't as prepared as he thought. The cold mountain weather hit him with an unexpected force, and he soon began suffering from hypothermia. I wonder if, at that moment, he began to doubt his plan. Was this the first time Bundy, the man who always seemed to have an escape route, felt he was on the brink of failure? Though incredibly cunning, he was also human. His body was beginning to fail him, and food and water were scarce. Even though he had escaped from jail, the mountains did not offer the refuge he had imagined. The capture in Aspen. Bundy spent 6 days in the mountains, evading authorities and desperately trying to survive. Finally, after wandering aimlessly, he stole a car and tried to return to civilization. At this point, Bundy was exhausted and disoriented. He was stopped by a highway officer, and his escape, which had started with such ingenuity and audacity, ended in an almost anticlimactic way. Bundy's capture in Aspen was a devastating blow to his ego. The man who had managed to escape from a prison and evade authorities for almost a week was caught by a simple traffic stop. It was proof that, while Bundy was intelligent and manipulative, he was not invincible. When I think about this first escape, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, it's impressive how Bundy was able to plan and execute his escape with such precision. It's almost like he was playing chess, moving each piece carefully to ensure his strategy was perfect. But at the same time, this escape reveals Bundy's true nature. It wasn't just about a man wanting to escape justice. It was a man who thrived on power, who fed on the feeling of being one step ahead of everyone else. For Bundy, the escape wasn't just a necessity, it was a declaration of his own control over the world around him. And yet, nature had other plans. Despite his cunning and skills, he could not overcome the harsh conditions of the mountains. It's ironic that, in the end, it wasn't the authorities who defeated him, but nature itself, something Bundy could neither control nor manipulate. A wounded, but not defeated monster. This first escape was not the end for Ted Bundy. In fact, it was only a prelude to what was to come. If anything, this escape demonstrated that Bundy was not willing to give up easily. Despite his capture in Aspen, his mind continued to churn. And the most terrifying part was that this first escape would only motivate him to plan something even more audacious, leading to a new escape, even more brutal crimes, and a fame that would make him one of the most sinister figures in U.S. criminal history. As he was taken back to prison, I wonder if Bundy was already thinking about his next move, his next opportunity to challenge the system. Because, for him, this wasn't a defeat. It was just a temporary pause in his master plan. The escape in Aspen gave us a glimpse into the real Bundy, a cunning, dangerous man, and completely unbreakable in his quest for power. And although this was only the first act of his escape saga, it left us with a sense of unease, knowing that as long as Bundy was alive, the game was far from over. And, as we would soon discover, the monster was far from defeated. The second escape, Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Glenwood Springs. Just mentioning the name brings to mind images of warm hot springs or the mountainous landscape of Colorado. However, for Ted Bundy, Glenwood Springs was a pivotal point in his reign of terror, the site of his second escape. An escape as bold as the first, but this time, much more calculated. As I delve into the events leading up to this escape, I can't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with horror. Bundy had not only learned from his first experience, but was now more determined than ever to achieve what he had failed to accomplish in Aspen. When he was transferred to the Glenwood Springs jail after his capture in Aspen, Ted Bundy wasted no time reflecting on his mistakes. The failure in the mountains had taught him something important. If he was going to escape again, he needed an even more elaborate plan. He couldn't rely solely on his wit and charisma. He knew he needed resources, time, and, above all, a strategy that would keep him out of reach of the authorities for much longer. But one thing was clear, Ted Bundy was not giving up. For a man like him, who thrived on the sensation of control and power over others, every failed opportunity was a lesson bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. He didn't just want to escape, he wanted to do it in a way that would completely humiliate the system. From the moment he was confined in Glenwood Springs, he began to observe, study the guards' patterns, make connections, and silently prepare his next move. Unlike his first escape, this one would not be improvised. Bundy had learned that improvisation could be thrilling but also dangerous. This time, he was going to build a plan that not only allowed him to escape but also gave him a significant advantage over the law. He knew that if he was caught again, escaping the next time would be even harder. In the Glenwood Springs jail, Bundy was confined to a small cell, which forced him to be even more ingenious. But what the authorities didn't realize was that even in the smallest space, Bundy found ways to manipulate his surroundings. The most surprising thing was that his cell was located directly below one of the guards' apartments. From there, Bundy could hear the footsteps, the movement on the upper floor, which gave him an idea. While the outside world continued as usual, Ted Bundy was already working on his escape. The meticulous plan. Ted Bundy began working on his escape in a way few would have imagined. He was determined to lose weight, and he did so with a clear goal. Instead of waiting for a fortunate opportunity like the one he had in Aspen, this time he decided he would escape through the roof of his cell. Yes, the roof. In his mind, he calculated every inch of the space around him. For weeks, Bundy ate less, slimming down his body to the point where he could fit through a narrow opening. Day after day, while the guards watched him without noticing his transformation, he prepared both physically and mentally for the escape. With improvised tools he managed to hide, he began making a hole in the roof of his cell, slowly removing the plaster and wooden framework. This process was gradual, and Bundy executed it with superhuman patience, knowing that any mistake would betray him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as the hole in the roof grew larger, enough for him to get through at the right moment. Here, one must pause and ask, how is it possible for someone confined in a cell to carry out such a meticulous plan without being discovered? But that was Bundy's dark genius. He knew how to move in the shadows, how to hide his true nature, and how to manipulate those around him. The guards trusted him, perhaps too much, and that was their mistake. The escape. On December 30th, 1977, Ted Bundy was ready. It was a cold winter night in Glenwood Springs, and the atmosphere was filled with the typical calm of the year-end. While many were thinking about the upcoming festivities, Bundy had other plans. He knew that night would be his best chance. As night fell and everything was quiet, Bundy made his move. He used the hole he had created in the roof to climb up to the upper floor, directly below the guard's apartment. From there, he slipped into the storage area, where he found clothes to help him blend in. Once outside his cell, there was no turning back. Ted Bundy was, once again, free. What was most surprising was the simplicity with which Bundy escaped. There were no dramatic chases or risky jumps. Just meticulous planning, absolute control of every detail, and the ability to act with total calm under pressure. Life on the run. After his escape, Ted Bundy headed to Chicago, where he began a new life, far from the radar of the authorities pursuing him. For him, each day of freedom was a personal victory. He knew that sooner or later, his past would catch up with him, but that didn't stop him. Bundy thrived on the adrenaline of always being one step ahead, and for a while, it seemed like he had succeeded. In the weeks following his escape, Bundy changed his appearance, using his charisma to avoid capture. He managed to survive by stealing cars and minor goods while carefully planning his next move. The people around him had no idea they were in the presence of one of the most wanted criminals of the time. But what followed his escape from Glenwood Springs was even more terrifying. Because freedom not only gave Ted Bundy the opportunity to evade justice, but also to continue his crimes. The consequences. News of Bundy's escape quickly reached the media. The public was in panic, and the authorities, humiliated by their inability to keep him in custody, launched a nationwide manhunt. But, in the meantime, Bundy was already hundreds of miles away, laughing at the system he had once again outwitted. What makes this escape even more shocking is the fact that, during his time on the run, Bundy continued his killing spree. The most infamous attacks were at Florida State University, where he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house and murdered two young students, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, on the night of January 15, 1978. It was a brutal act that shook the entire country. Every detail of this escape leaves me with a mix of awe and horror. It wasn't just a man fleeing the law. It was a predator once again loose, intent on continuing to destroy lives. Bundy, with his intelligence and cunning, had proven to be an even greater threat while free. When I think of Ted Bundy, I can't help but question how a man so charming and seemingly normal could have hidden such a cruel monster inside him. The escape in Glenwood Springs was not just an act of cunning, it was another testament to how far Bundy was willing to go to maintain his freedom and continue feeding his dark impulses. But the monster, though wounded, was not defeated. He knew that justice would eventually catch up with him, but in the meantime, Ted Bundy was determined to make the most of every moment, to continue playing his macabre game of power and control. This second escape was not just a getaway, it was a statement. Bundy would not stop until his last breath. And the most unsettling thing is that, during those weeks of freedom, no one knew how many more lives might be in danger. Florida and the final confrontation. As Ted Bundy arrived in Florida, his time as a fugitive reached an unprecedented level of madness and violence. He had escaped from prison for the second time, evading authorities once again. While the entire country was on high alert, Bundy, with his ability to blend in and disappear into the crowd, sought new ground for his dark desires. Florida became the stage for his final act, a confrontation with justice that would culminate in his ultimate capture. But before that moment arrived, Bundy would unleash a storm of horror that still reverberates in the criminal history of the United States. Arrival in Florida, a changed Ted. When Bundy arrived in Florida in January 1978, he was no longer the charming man who had seduced his victims and outwitted the police with his charisma. He had changed. He was more desperate, more reckless. He had cut his hair, lost weight, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. He knew he was cornered, but it didn't make him retreat. On the contrary, he seemed driven by an internal fury, a nearly primal need to reaffirm his power. He had temporarily settled in Tallahassee, a quiet university town. He rented a room under a false name and tried to stay under the radar. But the monster within him was restless, and it wasn't long before Bundy began killing again. If Bundy's previous crimes had been horrifying, what he did at Florida State University demonstrated a level of brutality never seen before. The Chi Omega attack. On the night of January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house, a student residence at Florida State University. It was around 2 in the morning, and while most of the young women were asleep, Ted Bundy entered with unrestrained fury. Armed with a piece of wood, he brutally attacked Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, two students who had no chance to defend themselves. The most chilling aspect was the speed and precision with which Bundy acted. In less than 15 minutes, he had killed 2 young women and severely injured 2 others, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, before fleeing the scene. He did so silently, with an absolute coldness that contradicted the brutality of his acts. When the first witnesses arrived, the devastation was unimaginable. Yet, what seemed like a senseless attack was actually part of the power and control pattern that had always driven Bundy. To him, these women were not people, they were symbols of his ability to dominate, to destroy what others valued. That was the core of his psychopathy. The fugitive killer. After the Chi Omega attack, Bundy didn't slow down. In his flight, he committed another murder shortly after, this time of a young girl named Kimberly Leach, only 12 years old. Her abduction and murder was especially heartbreaking and marked the last confirmed crime of Ted Bundy. It was as if Bundy had accepted that his time was ending and, instead of fleeing, decided to cause as much damage as possible before being captured. He traveled through Florida, stealing cars and using false identities, but no longer made an effort to hide his true nature. He had crossed a threshold and seemed to know that his capture was inevitable. The final confrontation. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was finally arrested in Pensacola, Florida. He was stopped by a police officer named David Lee, who found him driving a stolen car. Initially, Bundy tried to use his usual charm to get out of the situation, but when he realized it wouldn't work, he attacked the officer and tried to flee. After a brief struggle, he was arrested. This arrest was different. Ted Bundy was no longer the confident man he had been before. Instead, he was an exhausted man, a criminal cornered who had lost control of the situation. His arrest marked the beginning of the end of a terror era that had kept the entire country on edge. When he was tried in Florida for the Chi Omega and Kimberly Leach murders, Ted Bundy continued to try to manipulate the system in his favor. He chose to represent himself in court, using his legal training and charm to create a theatrical atmosphere during the trial. But this time, charm would not be enough. Justice finally arrives. Despite all his attempts to evade justice, Bundy was found guilty. The testimony of survivors, along with physical evidence, left no doubt about his guilt. He was sentenced to death by electric chair in two separate trials, one for the Chi Omega murders and another for the murder of Kimberly Leach. During his time on death row, Ted Bundy continued to manipulate those around him. He gave interviews, tried to delay his execution by confessing to other unsolved murders, and kept the media following until the last moment. In those interviews, Bundy revealed his true nature, a man who showed no remorse for his actions, a predator who delighted in the suffering of others. However, on January 24, 1989, justice finally caught up with Ted Bundy. He was executed in the electric chair at the Florida State Prison, ending the life of one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history. But the damage he had caused, the lives he had destroyed, could never be repaired. When I think about Ted Bundy and his last days in Florida, I feel caught between fascination and horror. On one hand, it's striking to see how one man could manipulate and deceive so many people for so long. On the other, it's chilling to remember that behind that facade of normalcy lurked a monster who enjoyed others' suffering. Florida was the stage for the final chapter in Ted Bundy's terror saga, a place where he ultimately faced the consequences of his actions. But while his life ended in that state, his dark legacy endures. Bundy's stories remind us that evil can hide in the most ordinary of people. And it is this duality, the charming appearance and the inner darkness, that makes Ted Bundy such a chilling and, at the same time, unforgettable figure. Now that we have explored the life and crimes of Ted Bundy, it's inevitable to ask, who was this man really? Was he simply a monster, or was there something more behind that charming smile, that magnetic personality that drew so many people to him? In this final stretch of our journey, I'd like to reflect on the true nature of Bundy, one that remains enigmatic and terrifying to this day. What makes Ted Bundy such a fascinating figure, even decades after his execution, is his ability to maintain an appearance of normalcy. Most serial killers we know have some trait that betrays them, whether in their behavior, their history, or their relationships. Bundy, however, seemed to embody two opposing realities. On one hand, he was the charismatic, educated man with a bright future. On the other, he was a ruthless predator who took pleasure in his victims' suffering. This duality continues to puzzle those who study his case. Like many of the most dangerous psychopaths, Bundy did not show obvious signs of his true nature. And it is precisely this ability to disguise himself that made him so deadly. He exploited the trust, the natural desire of people to believe in the best of others. And in doing so, he became an invisible hunter, operating in plain sight. Manipulation as a tool. A key aspect of Bundy's true nature was his ability to manipulate everyone around him. Even after being captured and brought to trial, he continued to exert control. He defended himself in court, flirted with the public and the media, and made sure there was always a narrative surrounding him that kept him in the spotlight. For Bundy, power was not only in physical violence, but also in the ability to control others' perceptions. Consider the times he managed to deceive authorities, escaping not once, but twice from prison. His intelligence and cunning allowed him to play the system, as if it were a personal challenge to prove he could stay one step ahead of everyone. But behind that facade of cleverness was a dark truth. Bundy not only enjoyed control, but also found pleasure in the suffering of others. To him, the pain of his victims and the anguish of those who loved them were proof of his superiority. The thirst for power. Beyond his desire to control, Ted Bundy was also driven by an insatiable thirst for power. Not political power, not money, but the most terrifying type of power, power over life and death. For Bundy, each crime was a reaffirmation of his ability to wield that power. Each victim was proof that he could destroy something beautiful and valuable simply because he wanted to. Throughout his life, Bundy exhibited a total lack of empathy. He was incapable of understanding the pain he caused in human terms. In his mind, people were tools, means to an end, the satisfaction of his own impulses. It's no wonder that, during his trials and interviews, he showed so little remorse. Even when he finally confessed to some of his crimes, he did so in a cold, calculated manner, as if talking about something trivial. The big question, why? As we reach the end of this story, one question continues to linger, why? Why did a man with such intelligence, with a life that seemed promising, choose a path of destruction and death? It's a question that has puzzled experts, psychologists, and criminologists for years. But the truth is, we may never get a satisfactory answer. We can theorize that his childhood, marked by confusion about his identity and possible abuse, might have influenced his development. We can talk about his possible antisocial personality disorder, his inability to feel empathy or guilt. But ultimately, Ted Bundy was an enigma, a being whose evil cannot be fully explained by any psychological or social theory. What we can assert with certainty is that Ted Bundy left a lasting impact on society. Not only because of the horror of his crimes, but because he forced us to rethink what we believe we know about monsters. Bundy was not the stranger in a dark alley, he was not the terrifying man we avoid on the street. He was someone you might have known, someone who could have been your neighbor, your coworker, even your friend. It is his ability to hide his true nature that makes him such a frightening figure. He reminds us that evil is not always obvious, that sometimes it hides behind a charming smile and a pristine appearance. And it is this lesson that continues to resonate to this day. So, what is the reward at the end of this journey? What have we learned from Ted Bundy's story? Perhaps the most important thing is that it has forced us to look beyond appearances, to be aware that evil can hide where we least expect it. Bundy showed us that true danger does not always come in the form we expect. However, we have also seen that, despite all his cunning and cleverness, Bundy could not escape forever. Justice, although it took time, eventually caught up with him. And in that sense, there is some satisfaction in knowing that, although the damage he caused can never be repaired, his story ended with the defeat of a predator. Now that we've reached the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Ted Bundy's true nature? Do you believe there's something more we can learn from his story? Share your comments, and let's continue exploring the darkest mysteries of the human mind together.